Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. I always warn people that I'm technologically challenged, and so there will be times that I will desperately call on Kip to give me a hand or to get me back in line. Um, I am so honored and humbled by your presence on this call. I'm so grateful for your commitment to this work and to doing something to change the dynamics around this issue that we call race. Just so you know, this program was only supposed to air once. So we are repeating it today because we had so many people ask us to repeat it, and there were some folks that wanted to be on and couldn't be on. Um, so I wanted you to know that this will be a repetition of last week's program. There will be nuances, of course, because I thought about some things that is sort of like, well, people may want to know more about this, that, or the other. So I've added some things, and as Kip said, you're going to get some information. So with that, I am going to share screen and go here. There we go. Okay, and by the way, I just chose people randomly. Kip asked me to pick some folks, and I couldn't go through the whole list, so I just randomly picked some folks. And so some of you may know me and some of you may not, okay? But as we go through with this call, you'll know a little bit more about me. So I need to, number one is I need to do this, to enlarge this. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of my background, so you'll see how I came to this work. So I was born and pretty much raised where the Middle Passage began. A lot of people don't know that the Middle Passage actually began in 1509 when the first enslaved Africans were taken to the Dominican Republic to work on the sugarcane plantations. I look at race from the perspective of both an insider and an outsider, and I'll explain what I mean by that. An outsider, I was born and lived the first 10 years of my life in the Dominican Republic, where there's a lot of colorism, there's racism there as well, but it takes on a completely different form. As an insider, because once I came to the United States, I was treated as an African American, although I am Afro-Latina. This is a little bit of my family, and I don't know just how well you can see that, but in the center are my mother and father, sitting on my oldest brother's porch. The children are my siblings. There's a sibling that's missing, actually two people are missing from that photograph, and that's the youngest sibling. And then and I'm actually the youngest, but there was one in between myself and the baby that you see in that photograph. On the left is my sister, and in her beautiful wedding dress, which she designed herself and had a friend work with her on it. It had over 120 little tiny hand-covered buttons on her dress. My sister was an amazing seamstress. My father was a technologist. By the time I was born, he was running the antenna station in our town. And one of my favorite things to do, my mother used to give me money. I don't know what it is. Oh, is that someone from, okay. So my mother used to give me money for the collection plate on Sundays. My father worked 6.5 days a week. And what I would do would be, I would go to the local frap store, I would buy a vanilla shake, and I would go visit my father at work. And my father never told my mother, and I love that we had that secret between us. The tiny picture in the middle, all the way in the back, is my grandmother. The reason that this picture is important to me is because I do this work with the permission and the acknowledgement of my ancestors. My mother was a brilliant speller. I mean, I was in college and I was asking her to spell certain words, and everyone in our family was bilingual except for myself, who became bilingual once I came to the US. The person on all the way to the right is my father. when he was a little boy. My father was born in 1901. And there's my father wearing his school uniform. If you can imagine the Dominican Republic where it's hot. He was in a private English school, so they wore wool uniforms. I'm an artist, and I was trained as an artist, and I live as an artist. I see the world through the eyes of the artist. I'm not sure what that is, but if everyone could turn off their mics, that would be helpful. Um, and and so as an artist, I see things a little bit differently sometimes than how other folks see it. And it served me really well in helping me to understand race and racism. I will say, so I went to Music and Art High School in New York, LaGuardia High School of Music and Art. And I also went to FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology. So that's really where I got, a lot of my art training. I'm a musician. I was trained to play the vocal cords. I wanted to be an opera singer. I was probably the only 11-year-old in the country who can sing the entire score of Cia della Memoir in Italian by the time I was 11 years old. There were a couple of musicians in my family. My father was a violinist, and my mother tells me when I was fussy as a baby, he used to play the violin for me. I have a brother who's also a violinist who taught me solfeggio, which is singing the scale back and forth and singing it one step versus half step and so on. And he also learned me to listen to music. Why this is important, this particular little piece of being taught to listen to music, is because what my brother taught me was he would have a record playing and it would be full orchestration. And he would have me listen to one instrument. And what I found that as I was listening to that instrument, all the other instruments seemed to disappear. Why that is important now is because we need to learn to focus on states of consciousness that allow us to turn off the rest of the noise of the world. And we need to do that to, one, stay sane, and two, so that we can begin to access the internal peace that is always within us. And we will talk about that as we move through the process. I'm a sound therapist. I used to teach sound therapy. I stopped teaching sound therapy in '97, got called back in 2003, taught it for about another 4 or 5 years. And I loved it. One of my fondest memories was teaching sound therapy in a geodesic dome in the middle of the mountains in Urbino, Italy. And that was one of the last gigs that I did when I was doing some of this work in Europe. I'm a Reiki master and teacher. All of my children are Reiki trained. My daughter has been a Reiki master and teacher since she was 15. Her youngest student was 5 years old. Her oldest student was 93. I used to teach meditation, and I still practice meditation. It's really important to me in order for me to self-care and stay sane given the toxicity of this work. And I also was a teacher and continue and forever probably will be a student of A Course in Miracles. I got my calling when I was 14 years old, the day that Dr. King died. I locked myself in the bathroom to cry because I was so upset over what had just happened. And my father kept knocking on the door going, "Are you okay in there?" And I didn't want my father to know that I was crying. And at first I started to cry because he had died, and then I started to cry for me. Because what I realized was that I was now living in a country where people got killed for having dark brown skin. That's how I internalized it when I was 13 years old. And somewhere, somehow, I seemed to have heard a voice that said that you are to continue the work. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that I wasn't going to do that. There was no way I was ever going to do race work, but yet here we are, because the calling keeps calling you till you say yes, and because it's the work of my heart. While I started out not wanting to do this work, I've been doing it for decades. It's been about 30 plus years that I've been doing this work, and I love it. I love it because I actually get to witness people change not just their minds, but their hearts before my very eyes. So I do this work because I love people and because I really believe that together, there's nothing we cannot accomplish. We can do anything in oneness and in community. So I have done this work in all kinds of organizations. I've done this work with um, um, corporate leaders, as well as with members of Congress and politicians and so on. So I've done this work for a very, very long time, and I could tell you stories. Mm-hmm. I've written 3 books on the subject. 11 Reasons to Become Race Literate, which started out to be an article that a friend of mine suggested I write. And I started working on it at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was midday. And I thought, oh, I think I might have a book. So 8 Essentials to a Race Conversation I wrote after that, because, and all of this comes out of 30 years of doing this work, right? So I wrote 8 Essentials to a Race Conversation because I realized that if people read the first book, they're going to start talking. And I wanted to give people a manual so that they could have those conversations in a way that doesn't turn the listener off. The third book I wrote because I was kind of pissy. Okay, I was angry over the fact that all I kept hearing was that African Americans have higher incidence of high blood pressure and diabetes and yada, yada, yada. And what I realized was nowhere was I hearing anyone talk about the intergenerational historical trauma that people carry with them in their bodies that causes some of these things that they're experiencing. And we'll talk about internalized racism in a little bit as we go through this program. And so I wrote Speaking Race in Healthcare because I felt like people in healthcare need to have this broader conversation that really addresses some of these issues beyond disparity around the extra stress that people carry. So that's me. So now let's talk about trauma. So just so you know, as a disclaimer, I am not a trauma therapist. I've taken some courses so that I could understand trauma because the work that I do is around intergenerational historical trauma. And so I needed to understand it well enough to be able to explain it to the people in my seminars, but I am not a trauma therapist. And those of you, as we go through and we look at some of the causes and some of the symptoms of trauma, some of you may want to actually access a therapist or talk to your doctor about that. I also needed to understand trauma for my own self-care and for my own healing process, really understanding what were some of the traumas that existed within my family, within the family structure that I lived in, within the country that I was raised in, so that I could understand how to take care of myself. So I took some courses with NICBOM, which is the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. And they have a lot of video trainings and things like that you can take if you want to learn more about this work. I also looked into cultural somatics training and racialized trauma course with Resmaa Menakem, who is a therapist, and he is the author of My Grandmother's Hands. So, nice deep breath. I want you to, and just, and let's take a minute to be present. And let's start with part 1, understanding racial trauma. So let's just get just the regular dictionary meaning of trauma, which is an injury, and it's usually to the physical, an injury to the physical body, a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from, and really there are a lot of ways that people can be injured, okay? So there's mental, there's emotional, there's physical, and so on, and they may or may not cause a person trauma. And then we also have an emotional upset. There have been changes over time in the definition of trauma because the first definition was really deciphered from people coming back from war and having to deal with post-traumatic stress syndrome or post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of what we know about trauma today comes from having studied survivors of the Holocaust during the Second World War, and it also comes from survivors of war and soldiers. So that's a lot of what we know about trauma. But nowadays, as the definition has changed, it also refers to an emotional wound, and it's also, you know, an experience of overwhelm that someone may have had, or having experienced some kind of traumatic event. So signs of racial stress include living in I'm going to jump and then I'm going to go back to trauma and how that connects. Living in an unsafe neighborhood, a threat to life, experiencing traumatic events that occur repeatedly. So, seeing someone be killed on a video, or someone, you know, getting handcuffed or beaten or any of those kinds of things can cause stress. So trauma can be primary, which is it's happened to you as an individual, okay? So you're the subject of a traumatic experience, or it can be secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is witnessing a traumatic event, hearing about a traumatic event, or reading about a traumatic event, okay? Which means that if your neighbor had a traumatic event and your neighbor came over and shared that story with you, so the neighbor was the primary recipient or primary experiencer of that event, but by you hearing that story, you could be traumatized. By you seeing a video of what happened to your neighbor, you could be traumatized, okay? Or by you reading the newspaper about what happened to your neighbor, you could be traumatized. As we go through the rest of this presentation, I want you to do, well, three things. The first thing I want you to do is to remember to breathe, especially when we go through the history piece. And then the other thing that I want you to do is to remember that what we know from researching trauma is that traumatized people traumatize others, particularly if there has been no healing involved with that trauma, and if the trauma is decontextualized, which sometimes people have traumatic events and they forget the event, but they're still acting out of that event. And the other thing that I want you to remember as we go through this is that trauma gets passed on. We now know that, that trauma gets passed on through epigenetics, which means that there is actually a change in the genes when people are traumatized. And so let me tell you a little bit of a story of something that I found in the Washington Post a few years ago. There was an experiment that was done with mice, and the researchers had mice in a cage, and they would pump in the fragrance of cherry blossom oil. And then they would electrocute the mice. So they would pump in the oil and they would repeat it. After a while, they didn't have to electrocute the mice anymore. All they had to do, it's kind of like Pavlov's dogs, right? All they had to do was to pump in the cherry blossom oil, and the mice would act traumatized. They found that the second generation of mice acted more traumatized than the first generation. So my theory around that is, you know, at least the first knew that there was something going on, right? The second generation has no context for what is happening to them. All they know is that cherry blossom oil traumatizes them. You know, it just really brings up, you know, heightens the nervous system. So they found the third generation, fourth, fifth, sixth. If you add to that the first generation, 7 full generations were afflicted by the trauma of the first generation. Now, why is that important? Because in a way, we've kind of known that trauma gets passed on for a long time. There's a little line in the Bible that says, and remember, the Bible were just books that were translated into this particular book that we call the Bible, right? So there's a line that says, "The sins of the father shall be visited on the son 7 generations hence." If you substitute the word sin for trauma, we realize that what happened to the first generation gets passed down through the generations. By the way, we also pass on talents and beautiful things. Okay, so it isn't just trauma that gets passed on. There are other things that also get passed on. But for our purposes and for understanding, it's important that we know that trauma gets passed on, because historical trauma is extremely important. We're not going to do trauma in the brain. Okay, so symptoms of PTSD. I'm going to see if I can move this up a little bit further. That'd be great. Okay. So, so some of the symptoms of PTSD is reliving. I saw a young woman on a news program the other day who had watched someone. It wasn't George Floyd. It was another African-American man that was taken down by the police, and he subsequently died. And she taped it with her phone, and she witnessed the whole thing. And she talked about, when they asked her how she was doing on the news, she said she was having trouble sleeping. She was really nervous and jumpy. Those are all signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So reliving the event, that's one of the things she said, that she closes her eyes and she sees it over and over again. Avoiding things that remind you of that event, like not walking down a particular street or not listening to a particular piece of music and those kinds of things. Having more negative thoughts and feelings than you did before, feeling on edge, angry, feeling unsafe in your environment, and just being generally irritable, and always being on guard and thinking that kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop and waiting for something to go wrong, okay? Those are all symptoms when you've had a traumatic event. And I wanted to put this in here because if you have family members that are exhibiting some of those symptoms, you might just want to have a conversation with them. If it's severe, they may need help. And I also wanted to put this in here because sometimes parents have the news on and they have it on going all the time, and the little ones are listening to that and they're watching the news. And sometimes parents do the best to guard their children, but you know how kids are. They still, they're listening because they're trying to put their world in order, right? So they're trying to figure out what's going on. And so if your little ones start showing irritability, or they numb out, or they disconnect, all the symptoms are pretty much the same for both adults and children. But as a parent, you might just want to keep an eye on, because there's a lot going on in the world right now, and our little ones are absorbing that information. And so it's important that we keep an eye on the people that we love. So let's talk about race and trauma. So for people of color, and particularly for Black people, race is something that causes continual trauma, okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that. And people are continuously challenged. If you're a brown person, you're continuously challenged by some kind of racial event. So when you are traumatized, there are a couple different things that can happen, and I'm going to keep it at just two things, because there are a lot of different things that can happen, but I'm going to keep it simple so that we're just looking at two things. One of them is fight or flight. The other one is paralysis or faint, okay? And so if you go into fight or flight, what happens is your blood pressure goes up, your heart begins to beat faster, and you're just generally agitated. You might breathe faster, and so on and so forth. If you go in the other direction, where you go more into paralysis, what happens is you get frozen, okay? Your blood pressure goes down. Some people can even pass out because their blood pressure drops so much. So when we're dealing with issues of race, we are dealing with continual trauma for people of color. And we're also dealing with decontextualized trauma. And the reason I refer to decontextualized trauma is because for the most part, in our schools and in our systems, we haven't learned the history. And the reason, a lot of the reason for that is because that history is pretty horrific, okay? I mean, if you think that what you're watching on television now is bad, it was even worse, okay? And so the the trauma piece, people act out of trauma that's decontextualized because it's in their bodies, okay? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's important to understand that there's a lot of the history that we don't know, but the trauma that was experienced by others in your family and in your group can still be affecting you, okay? So it's important to understand that. Continual and institutionalized and systemic racism is one of those things that is, well, I mean, we're seeing it on TV now. The contacts with the police, with the judicial system. There are laws that that negatively affect people of color, and so on and so forth. So that's the institutionalized and systemic piece. Daily micro and macro aggressions, which is, you know, someone saying something to you that that you find offensive. So those are the micro aggressions. The larger aggressions would be like, you know, driving home after work and you get stopped by the police and you have no idea if you're going to make it home or not. You know, those kinds of things. Negative media images. I mean, these are all things that feed into. So people who have already been traumatized are continually traumatized or re-traumatized by some of these experiences, right? So negative media images and stereotypes, hierarchical caste systems that are based on color or colorism, which is whose skin is lighter, whose skin is darker, and that kind of thing. If you want to learn more about colorism, I did a podcast for the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. So if you just look up my name, University of St. Thomas, and colorism, it'll come up, and it gives the history of colorism, and it helps to explain what that is and what it looks like today and how it affects us today. So racially hostile work environments. A lot of us work in environments where people, because they're not conscious and because they're not aware of their biases, say and do things that are received as an offense on the other side. And so that's like the minimum, right? At the maximum, people will lose their jobs because of the lack of understanding and the lack of compassion around this particular topic. So racially hostile schools and much, much more. So this is what people of color are dealing with on a regular basis. And we're gonna, okay, here we go. So I'm skipping some of these because we only have an hour. So we're just gonna, this is like scratching at the tip of the iceberg. So this is one of my favorite quotes by Henry David Thoreau, which is, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil and only one who is striking at the root. When we're talking about race, people want to solve race from the interpersonal perspective. Like people will say to me, well, if somebody says this, what should I say? You know, like they literally want me to give them a response for a conversation that hasn't even happened, or it may have happened yesterday and they're still thinking about it, okay? Very few people are attacking racism at the root, and that has to do with the fact that we've been disconnected from the root of this stuff, okay? So we're gonna go to the root, and I want you to take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And I also want you to be conscious of your breathing as we go through the history. And keep, remember to keep time for me,
Sounds good. Yep, we're at 12:40.
Okay, great. So here's how we got there. And I'm speaking specifically, racism is a global problem, okay? It just is. But I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the US, okay? And North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. So I'm going to take us on a little journey back to Europe during the Middle Ages. Europe was ruled by monarchies and the papacy. And because the monarchies had a relatively few number of people, family members and so on, versus the populace that they were looking to control, they had to find ways of controlling people. The easiest way to control people is to destabilize them. The easiest way to destabilize them is through violence. So there was a lot of violence during this time frame. And we're talking, I'm taking us back to around, the 1500s. Some of you may have read or learned about the Spanish Inquisition. Well, it was called the Spanish Inquisition, but the truth is that stuff was going on all over Europe, where, they were burning people at the stake. They would, the word in this country is lynch, right? They would hang 5 or 6 people at one time. The photograph that you see here is called the breaking wheel. And the breaking wheel was, they would tie, people with their hands up, and they would tie people's hands and legs to this wheel. They would turn the wheel, and there would be somebody with a stick trying to break your bones. And of course, someone from the church trying to get you to confess and to be forgiven of your sins. Now, if you notice in this little lithograph, there were a lot of people here, okay? So here's what they would do. People would travel from all over Europe to see one beheading or one of these spectacles, these violent spectacles. If you did not want to attend and you stayed home, they sent the soldiers out to get you so that you would come and watch what was happening to that person. The thing is that when people went out to see these things, they didn't exactly leave the kids home with the babysitter. So you have the adults being traumatized, the teenagers being traumatized, the little ones and the babies, everybody's being traumatized. If you happen to have missed it, they would parade the body or the head or whatever it was through town, or put it somewhere where it was visible to the entire town, because it was meant to destabilize you so that you could be controlled. One of the easiest ways to control people is through punishment. So in order to be able to do this and have this become law, well, let me not get ahead of myself. So in Europe, there was really, at that point, there was no middle class. You were either rich or you were poor. So they had the nobility, and then they had indentured servants, and they had enslaved people. Now, Europeans rarely talk about their enslavement, okay? But the truth is that England put abolitionist laws in the books in 1709. They did that because they were enslaving their own people, okay? Slavery was rampant all throughout the world, but people like to think that it never existed in their country, all right? But the reason that England put the abolitionist laws in the books in 1709 was because they were enslaving people. At that point, they no longer needed to enslave the Europeans, because they had all of these enslaved people in their colonies. Remember the saying, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire because it has so many colonies all over the world. So that abolitionist law didn't really spread to the colonies, okay? It didn't need to, because they no longer needed to be enslaving the Europeans for free labor, because they already had a free labor force and they'd had it for 200 years, okay? So people were either indentured, enslaved, or poor. So remember to breathe, okay? Trauma became institutionalized. Institutionalized violence is institutionalized trauma, okay? And as I said before, it was for reasons of destabilization and colonization. Let me say this. Prior to the Middle Passage and the enslavement of people in the so-called New World and the colonies in those particular parts of the world, Europeans and Africans had a long-standing history of trade and diplomacy. There were Africans in positions of leadership all over Europe. And you see it in their lineage, like, Queen Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who is a descendant of the de Sousa family, who was the wife of King George III, who was the king during the American Revolutionary War. Do you think we should know that it was a Black woman who was his wife? Okay, but so there's a lot of history that we don't get told and that we don't know. So how and why this was established was very specific, and there were in Europe, the person who could inherit was the firstborn male. Okay, if you were female, your family was rich, you weren't going to be first in line to get the money. Okay, so once the Europeans and the natives and the Africans are now particularly on these islands all over the Caribbean, they started to do what human beings do, which is they started to procreate. Some people had relationships, some people fell in love, some people were raped. I mean, it was all, it was span the gamut because that's the human condition, right? And as Europeans began to see that, they realized that they needed to let everyone know who could inherit. So inheritance was something that was, you had to be married, and your child, so when your child could inherit. So even if there were two Europeans who made it and had a child, if that child was born out of wedlock, you didn't necessarily have the right. I mean, they could actually write you into a will. They could do that, okay? But you pretty much didn't have the natural right to inherit, okay? So now you have these European men raping these women who were native and who were African, and they're having children with them, and some of them are firstborn male for them. So they wanted to make sure that those people knew that they could not inherit, okay? And so they created something called castas. And las castas is, as you can see, is a pictorial, because remember, a lot of people couldn't read and write. So institutionalized racism, they institutionalized that if you were Black or person of color, you could not get married, okay? So that was one of the things. So you were not part of that institution that allowed your children to inherit, okay? So you could not inherit. Mixed marriages or blended marriages, as they're called now, the children of those could not inherit, okay? I'm sorry, not marriages, but unions, because remember, the marriages were illegal. So those children could not inherit. And so you have things like, when you look at the castas, each procreation was given a name. And so we still have, some, they were mostly animal names like wolf, mulattoes. And a lot of have heard of the word mulattoes. Mulatto comes from the word mule. And it was meant as a message. So that blended race child was called mulatto, and the message was that if a European male mated with an African or a native female, that child was called mulatto. So a lot of people think that means mixed. It actually means mule. What is it that mules cannot do? They cannot reproduce. Okay, so the message for the men was, if you mate with one of those, that's the end of your lineage. Okay, so a lot of men had children that they would pretend were not their children, and you know, and that kind of crazy. And we're not even going to. This is like really deep, because there was also the fact that once slavery got established or institutionalized, they were trying to grow a crop, literally a crop of enslaved people, because each person was worth money. And the more people you own, the wealthier you were deemed to be. Because then you could sell people, you could trade people, and so on and so forth, okay? So the women were systematically raped on a regular basis. And then there was this whole thing around what they would do with Black males and Black females to get the female pregnant as soon as she reached puberty, which, you know, anywhere between the ages of 12 and 15. So these were little girls that were made to have one child after another after another. And they were also particular about who they would mate people with. They would look for particular characteristics, particularly in the male. You know, they were looking for somebody who was strong and so on and so forth, because again, they're growing a crop of laborers is basically what they were doing. And they kept very strict records through baptism and marriages and death certificates and things like that. So how racial trauma affects us today is in our actions, reactions, and interactions. There are 4 levels of racial conditioning, pretty much levels of racial conditioning, or 4 levels of racism. There's institutional, systemic, internalized, and interpersonal. Remember what I said earlier, that we try to solve racism from the interpersonal perspective? There are 3 other levels prior to that. So I'll explain what I mean by that. How we institutionalize something is we turn it into law, okay? Then we set up systems to make sure that the people follow the law, whatever it is that we've institutionalized. And as a result of living in an environment where there are institutions and systems that dictate a particular thing, people internalize those systems, and they interact with each other out of what they have internalized. And they don't even know that they're doing it, okay? Some people are conscious of it, and some people are unconscious of it, and sometimes we're conscious of one thing and not another. This is where your implicit bias comes from. See, the thing is that we all have biases, but not all of our biases are institutional and systemic. And as a result of living under systems that have institutionalized racism, we internalize the racial conditioning that is in the system, and then we interact with each other out of what we've internalized. And we don't even know that we're doing it. We're not always aware that we're doing it. So I'll give you one example from my own life. I was born in the 50s, and I was born, as I said before, in the Dominican Republic. In the 1950s, in the Dominican Republic, there was a dictator. His name was Trujillo. And he did what all dictators do, made people disappear, chop people up, blah, blah, blah. And I'm hearing all of this stuff in the news as a little child. There were also people in our community that disappeared. And so I'm growing up and I'm hearing this and I'm experiencing this, not realizing that through that experience and the things that I'm watching on television, things I'm hearing on the radio, I'm internalizing the dictatorship, okay? And the only reason I know that now is because I've done so much work on myself to try to understand racism. So now I understand what happened to me in the past, okay? There are times now I've lived in this country, for over 50 years. There are still times that I say and do things that come out of that conditioning. And my children hear it, or they see it and they go, wow, Mom, where's that coming from? So they call me on it, and I suddenly realize, oh, wow, that's coming out of, like, now I have an awareness of it, so I can do something about it. But prior to that, I had no idea. I was acting out of the conditioning that I internalized by living under a dictatorship, okay? So how does that link to what I'm talking about? We collectively are living under a racialized system that was established over 500 years ago. It has been passed down from generation to generation, and each one of us has interpreted and internalized the caste system based on where we fall in that caste system. And now the caste system lives in our bodies and we act out of it, not to mention all the current stuff that we add on top of what we were already carrying from our ancestry. So nowadays, we're holding racism in our body in one form or another. So how we internalize the caste system is different based on the group that you belong to. So if you're a white person, how you internalize that system, how it's internalized in your body, and we're going to do a little exercise to show you where racism lives in your body, is you internalize it as supremacy, which means, which shows up as not consciously all the time, although sometimes consciously, okay? I'm better than, I'm smarter than, I should get paid better, I should get the better jobs, I should be the leader, I should be the one running things because after all, I'm superior. If you are a brown-skinned person, you internalize the colonization. And so the motto is, how can I serve? I want to serve. You know, people expect you to serve. You are expected to do lower level jobs, and those kinds of things by those who internalize the supremacy piece. Okay, not good or bad, right or wrong. It is what it is. The thing is that if we don't understand what we're dealing with, it's hard to deconstruct it. But once we understand what we're dealing with, it's like, it's game over, okay? Because then we understand some of the things that we need to do so that we can transform it. If you're a Black person, you internalize the trauma as enslavement. Let me also say this. We all internalize various parts of this. We just have more of one than the other based on the group that we're in, okay? Ultimately, this is all about oppression, and we're all oppressed. The thing about the difference around the oppression piece between Black people and people of color is that brown people and Black people, we know we're oppressed, okay? But white people have their oppression hidden behind privilege, which is, the translation for privilege is access and opportunity. So your oppression is hidden behind access and opportunity, and as a result, you don't even see it. You don't see it. And it's access and opportunity is kind of a payment for not rocking the boat around what's happening to your brothers and sisters. So as a result, you've learned to stay silent, to not say anything, to not rock the boat, because you know what? You still have trauma in your body that says that if you break the rules, you could be the one that gets put on the breaking wheel, okay? And you know, and it doesn't necessarily mean that literally, but it could mean that figuratively. And you're very well warned about doing that. So where does racism live in your body? Where is it? How can you find it? So we're gonna do a little exercise to give you a sense of where that is and what it feels like. So if you're holding anything, you have anything in your hands, I want you to put it down. I want you to put your feet flat on the floor. And you just kind of relax for a minute, take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And just be present, just be present. And if it helps you, you can close your eyes. And what I want you to do is I want you to notice how your feet feel on the ground or inside your shoes. If you can feel, if you're wearing socks, how the socks feel and so on. I want you to notice how your bottom feels as it hits the chair, if you're sitting down, or how you feel on that sofa. I just want you to be aware of where you are in this moment. And now I want you to bring your awareness inside your body. And I want you to notice if there are any changes as you say silently to yourself, racism, racism, racism. And notice how your body feels, if there are any changes in your body, and if you can pinpoint where you feel racism in your body. And take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And I want you to say to yourself silently again, peace, peace, peace. I am peace. And notice if you feel anything in your body with the word peace. And I want you to take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And open your eyes. And Kip, can we get a view of everyone? Is that possible?
It's a little unwieldy to turn on all the videos again, but I did enable the chat again.
Okay,
So
great.
If people want to write their reactions there and what it felt like as
Okay.
you said the word race and then said the word peace, people can go ahead.
Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to first notice if you felt a difference between the word race or racism in your body and the word peace in your body. And can we call in a couple people though?
Sure.
Can we have a couple people volunteer who actually felt the difference to tell us what that difference was? Is there like a hand raising thing or something?
Yeah, you can raise hands.
Okay. And then we can turn on their microphone so that they can speak to it. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much. So could we get like maybe 3 different people who felt the difference between the two?
Sure.
And oh, wait a minute. Where are we with time? Oops.
Yeah, it's 1:00. So I think if we can wrap up this portion,
5 to 10.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, great.
So Zobita, can you unmute?
Yes. Hi. Hello, Milagros. Hi, Kip. Hey, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, definitely when I heard racism, because I'm of Indian ancestry, person of color, I felt like fire burning from my entire body. My body completely tense up, nausea, my throat constrict, just absolute, like a volcano wanted to erupt. When you repeated it more and more, the feeling became more and more intense. When you started to say peace, it is like something calming down, like coolness, sort of drenching my body and getting back to a calm state, and the throat relaxing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's do one more because we're a little bit over time.
Brenda, can you unmute?
Hi, thank you. When I heard racism, I felt a very cold pang in my heart, and when I thought of peace, I felt a lightness moving upward from my upper chest up my head.
Thank you. So here's what I'm going to say about that. When we I just want to give you a little bit of information about the experience that you just had, from what I know, again, with this work and the somatic piece around it. Where you felt racism is often where you and your biological tribe, meaning your family, will tend to get sick. So where we store our negative energy or things that we that are harsh for us is where we tend to get sick. So those of you who felt it in your chest, you probably have a family history of heart problems, breast cancer, respiratory problems, problems with your lungs, and that kind of thing. Those of you who got the tight jaw, you probably have a family history of locked jaw, of sinus problems, problems with your eyes, and so on and so forth. So the way you tend to store your negative energy is where you tend to get sick. So why that is important is because you also just had an experience. And by the way, usually those negative energies like anger and all those kinds of things tend to feel like a block in your body, versus peace, which I would venture to say just about everybody who could feel the difference felt peace as a moving energy. It felt like like that energy could just move. It just was moving out of your body, kind of thing. Okay, so it felt radiant as opposed to locked in place. So the reason that's important is because you now have had an experience of how you can shift things very quickly in your own body. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to move. So that's that little bit about peace is important because race is first of all, race is not real. It is not real. There is no biology that can attest for race. Okay, we are one human family. We're all related, and we're all related to one woman in Central Africa. We're all Africans. Okay, and scientists estimate that it takes about approximately 20,000 years for you to lose your melanin as you move into the colder climates where there's less sun, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say that because it's important for people to understand that. Creating peace within your body is something that you just did. And because this topic is so toxic and there's so much toxicity around it, particularly with all that's happening right now, you need little bits and pieces of things that will help you get, in your body very quickly and will help bring some sense of calm and peace within your body. So I'm gonna, let's see if I can do this. Okay, then maybe I can go back. I wanna, okay. So I wanna talk about the role of the heart, and then we're gonna do a short meditation, very quick meditation to get you back in your body and to deal with some of this stuff. So when you're dealing with trauma, what happens is you've got these heightened moments of energy, and then you need to bring yourself back down. Okay, what happens with people who are dealing with racism is that they don't get much of a chance to settle. When you come back down, it's called settling. Okay, so you just had, and somebody said something to you at work, you went like this, and then you try to settle, and then you're driving home and you get stopped by the police. So, so you're constantly in this up and down, and you settle less and less and less. So, which is literally the definition for high blood pressure, okay? Because we talked about how it gets the blood pressure up, so you're not bringing the blood pressure back down, okay? So, ways to settle yourself and bring yourself back down is by engaging as many of the senses as you possibly can. So I'm going to share with you an exercise that just came to me while I was walking in nature. Those of you who know me know I love my walks. Don't mess with my walks in the woods. You want to engage as many of the senses as possible when you've had one of these heightened experiences. So one of the ways to bring yourself back down is to notice what you hear, notice if there's a smell, notice what you see, and describe those things in words. Like, I am seeing, two cars. Because what the idea, once you've had that heightened experience, is to get yourself to settle as much as you possibly can. So you want to also have a relationship with nature. And for those of you who can't get out into nature, and I know right now with COVID, a lot of people aren't able to leave their home. There are a lot of beautiful nature videos on YouTube. So if you're on this call, you have access to some beautiful, things to again, that these are ways of bringing you and getting you settled. And then I engaged in an exercise recently that was very helpful to me. And I call it, there it is, okay? So I was in the woods and I took a honeysuckle and I was tasting it. So notice I'm engaging the senses, right? So I was tasting the honeysuckle, I was smelling the fragrance, and I was looking at the colors of the leaves, and all of a sudden, what came to me was, there it is. There is love. There is love. That's what love looks like. And as I went on my walk that day, I usually make eye contact, but I purposely not just made eye contact with people, but heart contact, and silently said, there it is. There it is. There's that love that we look for all the time. And it's in the air that we breathe. It's always around us. That peace that we all want is inside. You just experienced it. You've never lost it. It's always there for you. Okay. So I'm going to do a short, very, very short meditation. Where are we, Kip?
Yeah, we've got about 20 minutes. So if we can do 5 minutes of meditation. And
No. We're going to do, no. I'm like Carolyn Mays. We're going to get right to it. Okay. So what I want you to do again is put anything down, feet up flat on the floor, take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And I want you to bring your vision inward and center it in the center of your chest, what some of us call the heart chakra or the heart center. And I want you to imagine that there is a beautiful, beautiful light, like the light of the sun, S-U-N, the sun, that's shining inside of you. And I want you to take that sunlight and radiate it so that it bathes every single cell of your body. And I want you to take that beautiful sunlight and radiate it so that it fills the entire room that you're in. Radiate it out into your town. Radiate it out into the entire country and in the entire world. And I want you to flood that light with appreciation and love, whatever that means to you. And then I want you to go back and focus in the center of that light and imagine that you can flood the light itself with love, and watch how much brighter that light gets. That's the light that lives in you. That's your beauty, your essence, your power. That's who you really are. No matter what is happening or what has happened to any of us in our lives, that is the greatest force that we have, and it lives right there in our own hearts. And you always have access to it. You simply have to choose it. Take a nice deep breath. Blow it out. Let's all come back together. Thank you so much for this, and we're going to open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Milagros. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and we can unmute your mic for you. There was a question that came up earlier, Milagros. Actually, a couple people who asked this question, or something similar to this question, around why is this work important for white people to do? So, you gave us so much information on the historical trauma that Black and brown people deal with because of these caste systems and because of slavery, but why is it essential for white people to do this as well?
Well, first of all, the historical trauma does not just apply to Black and brown people. Everybody's tribes have experienced historical trauma, okay? So let's just be clear about that. This is the most recent, and the one that affects us the most is the intergenerational historical trauma of Black and brown people is what's really affecting us right now in terms of, just seeing it and being with it. This work is extremely important for white people, particularly in the United States, around the world, but particularly in the United States right now.
Sorry, real quick, Milagros, can you stop your screen share so we can just see your face?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Towards the top. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So, so that's extremely important because in the United States, the people who are making the laws, the people who are institutionalizing and setting up systems are white people. One of the things that I tell people all the time is that racism is a problem for people of color. It is not the problem of people of color. I know that every time something racial happens, white people look at Black and brown people as if we could solve it. We can't. That's not our problem, okay? Racism is a white problem. Our problem, people of color's problem, is how we internalize the colonization and how we internalize the enslavement and those forms of oppressions that come from that. But racism is a problem for people of color, but not the problem of people of color. So white people have to solve that. And in reality, all the violence that you're seeing right now, if white people don't step up and do this work, Black and brown children will never be safe. It's as simple as that. Because if a white person decides that they're scared because your child is walking down the street, they'll call the police will pick up your child. They may not even have done anything. White people need to get this. This is work. This is, I have a lot of friends who have spent thousands of dollars on personal growth. This is part of your personal growth because the system that white people and people of color live under is it's historically I know my friends in England call it the nanny system, right? So it's a patriarchy. Patriarchy needs for you to be infantilized because infants are easier to control than grown-ups, okay? So if we have a patriarchy, then more than likely people under that patriarchy are going to be infantilized, which means that your own personal growth is compromised. But through that compromising, the unwillingness to talk about race, the unwillingness to own race as a white issue, you're hurting other people. And I know, particularly the people on this call, your hearts are all about connection and love. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be on this call, okay? But if you don't become conscious of how you're being used by the way that the things are structured, then you're not gonna change it because you don't even know your role in it. You gotta find your role in it so that you can shift it. We all need to work together because together we can change anything. So that's why it's important for white folks to do this work, okay? And you need to show up with, look, we all need to show up with our brokenness, with our wholeness, with our pieces of ourselves. The Native Americans do something that is really, really powerful. They do something called soul retrieval because every time you're traumatized, you leave a little piece of your soul behind. There is no way that you can traumatize another person without your soul being compromised. That's just not gonna happen, okay? So it isn't just about the people who are being traumatized, it's about the people who are perpetrating the trauma that also need healing. They also need healing. And it's important to understand that. And I know some people are gonna get upset, it's like, we need to go beat up on the police. You know what? We all need healing because we're all living under this big umbrella that we didn't create, we inherited, okay? But we can transform it. We have the power to do that. We can do that. The next question, that I don't want to,
Yeah.
I know people that have to go at 1:30.
Yes, and just I'm pausing the chat right now because there's so many questions and so much conversation. So I'm just pausing it right now. I think it's is it Tamarin or Tamarin? I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I just asked you to unmute.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'll turn on my video too.
Thanks.
Oh no, my hair. Oh no!
Oh, you look great.
You look beautiful. We love you just the way you are.
Sorry, I also put my question in the chat, and I thought I liked the way that I phrased it. It was the question is what do we do when we watch the news and feel traumatized, and then we have to go right back into a work meeting, which is essentially my situation right now. I'm going to go into an all hands meeting and I'm going to have to be normal, but I am feeling the pressure in my chest left over from all week has been reliving and in getting ancestral and feeling in my genes. It feels like I feel it all in me, but I also want to be a high performer. And so I want to go into the all hands meeting and I work with all white people. And I don't want to seem like I've just been traumatized. So what would you suggest for like a pick me up or a quickie to sort of get back into the swing of things, but without suppressing my emotions?
Yeah. So so go to the ladies' room and do what I call heart chakra breathing, which is inhaling and exhaling out of your heart center. So, so nice, long, slow, deep breaths, which you're going to use your imagination to see the air coming in. You're breathing in and out of your mouth, right? Long, slow, deep breaths in your heart, into your heart center. It's like breathing into the light that we just talked about, right? And exhaling out of that heart center. And if you do those breaths, by the time you do, like the fifth or sixth breath, you're going to feel nice and calm. So that's one of the things that you can do. And I would suggest everybody on this call, if you want to know more about the heart is the first organ that gets created in your body. And as if that weren't significant enough, we now also have a lot of research information that tells us about, the electromagnetic field that you put out of your body. That breathing can help you with that, because when you go into that meeting, if you're agitated, then after a while the meeting will get agitated, because our electromagnetic fields talk to each other. Okay. And so you do want to enter that meeting with as much calm as possible. What I would say is to schedule yourself a grief session. Okay. So you may not be able to do that right now because you got to go to ladies' room, do your thing, right? But schedule yourself sometime in the next day or so, tonight, a session where you just let it flow. You got to beat up on pillows. If you got to scream, if you need to just let yourself sob, let yourself do that, because what happens in our culture is we don't do emotions and then they like erupt, right? So take care of yourself on a regular basis so that you don't have to erupt. And and it'll also help. It'll not just help you, but it'll help the people around you. Carrying a sense of peace is not just important to you, it's also important to the people in your life. So I would suggest those of you who haven't heard of HeartMath that you check out their website. There's a lot of wonderful research now that we have on the human heart. And right now, I think because of COVID, they're letting people have access to a lot of their videos and information for free. So for those of you who want to know more about how to work with the heart and heart coherence, which allows the brain to work better and so on, I mean, there's a lot of really good information there. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome, thank you.
One more?
Yes. Let's see here. Davina, you can go ahead.
Hi.
Hello,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for selecting me. I do have a question about this conversation that everyone is pushing white and Black people to have. And I feel as though having this conversation we're like, I'm a Black female. I'm born in the US, and I feel like we're asking the white people or those who control the laws and our society, these systems that you were talking about, to change them and to do something for us on our behalf. But in that process, I feel as though we are in a position of reinforcing that supremacy that they have. It's like, give us something to help us to alleviate our feelings of racism or the consequences of it. So how can we have that conversation without reinforcing, I'm in this slave position, so to say, and they're in this supremacy position to give me something to help myself?
The first thing is that in that conversation, they're not giving you anything. They really are giving themselves something, because there's a level of alienation that has happened because of people not knowing and not understanding their Black history, regardless of the color of their skin. And so there's that. When it comes to conversations on race, so there are two things. One of them is we have to face the facts. The facts are, these are the people who are still running the world, okay? I don't care what anybody says. It is, in this country particularly, it is what it is. So you have to, you can't start with the fulfillment of the vision. Again, that's the branches, right? You have to start at the root. And the root is what is right now. And right now, it is what it is, okay? So we have to work with what we have. And so what we have is a system that is controlled in that way and was kept at that level of control out of fear, okay? And we don't even have time to get into that piece of it. So looking at this from a different perspective is really important, and understanding the perspective that you have going into that conversation. For instance, I always tell people when they come to my seminar, I'm not there to make them anything. I give people information, and I trust people to be intelligent enough, willing enough to do whatever it is that they need to do with that information. We need to have these conversations together because it affects all of us. It affects all. White people are not doing us a favor by showing up to that conversation. What they are doing is creating a collective community with all of us to be able to figure out how we first dismantle some of the stuff that's going on. But remember that even if you change the laws, you cannot legislate people's hearts, okay? So you have to deal with not just with the institutional and systemic, you also have to deal with what people have internalized because of the institutional and systemic. So this is about all of us working together, but we have to work with it. Let me give you a quick example. During the civil rights movement, when people took to the streets, there was a group of people who took to the streets. They were out protesting, just like we see the protesters out there. The difference was that there was Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson. There were all these people who were negotiating with the leaders. They weren't going to the leaders like, can you do us a favor and do something about racism? They were negotiating one-on-one with those leaders, okay? So it isn't like when you're invited, as you're a white person, you're invited to the table because we need a favor from you. That's not what this is about. And we need to start looking at that differently. We need to be aware of the facts, right? Because the reason that Dr. King went to talk to the Kennedys wasn't because he thought the Kennedys could do him a favor. He wanted to inform the Kennedys of the things that they could do to make a difference because they had the power to make the difference. Does that make sense? So it isn't about asking for favors. It's about being aware of the fact that we need to do this together. White people need information from us because we've been living this stuff. So we have the information to give them, And white people need to show up to the conversation because they need to learn to know themselves and they need to figure out how to dismantle this stuff. So I hope that helps. I hope that that makes sense and it helps.
Okay, great. So we are just about at time. Milagros has a way of like wrapping everything up at the very end, which is great. For everyone who registered for this call, there will be a follow-up email tomorrow. It'll include a video of today's call so you can rewatch it, okay? It's unlisted on YouTube, and we're asking that you not like post this video publicly, right? Because Milagros' time and expertise is so valuable. And as I'm sure many people on the call know, a lot of times women, and particularly women of color, are asked to give away their work for free, and that's not okay. But Milagros does want to make this work accessible. So feel free to share the video link with those who need it, but don't post it publicly. In the email, there will also be a list of resources, links to more events, and a volunteer survey, which I'm going to drop in the chat here if you want to get involved as a volunteer. You should be able to click into it there. I think that's it for me. Milagros, do you have any last words?
Yeah, I want to just say to all of you, thank you so much for showing up. Next week, we're going to do race and grief because a lot of us, as was pointed out earlier, don't take the time to grieve. And yet we carry this internalized grief because human beings are wired for connection. So segregation is something that doesn't work for the human soul. And so I want us to talk about race and grief, and that's really important. So that's going to be next week's program. If you have friends, neighbors, anyone that you feel can benefit from this work, please invite them to next week. We're going to continue to do these as long as we feel that people need them. We're calling them the Lunch and Learn programs. So it'll be on a Monday. It'll, same time, same bat station. And I want to just thank you for being here, for caring so much about this. I can't even tell you how much I love that you have joined us. And I hope that you will join us. You will continue to join us next week. All of these programs are available as full seminars for those of you who work with companies or want to learn more. Thank you again. I love you. I'm so glad that we're beings together on this journey. Thank you so much.